So let me take you on a personal journey. Uh, it, it's sort of an odd journey because for the last few decades, I've been thinking about genetics, I've been thinking about genomics, I've been thinking about how do you alter life if you change gene patterns, gene instructions, and what does that do? And along that road, I had the privilege of participating in research expeditions. I helped create a company that made the first synthetic life form. And I got to the point a few years ago where I started thinking of body parts in terms of teeth. So you're born with no teeth, you grow a set of teeth, you give away the first set to the tooth fairy, and then you grow a second set of teeth. But the fundamental problem is if you go and play hockey or if you have an accident or something and you lose some of that second set of teeth, then it doesn't regrow. And that's very odd, right? Because if your body has the instruction set to make teeth once, to make them twice, it should be able to make them a third time, and a fourth time, and a fifth time, because that entire gene set is inside each of your cells, and we call that the human genome. So the human genome contains the instructions in each of your cells to make every one of your body parts. And de facto, it's made 2 knees, and it's made 2 kidneys, and it's made 2 lungs, etc. And I think we're getting to the point in places like Anthony Atano's lab at Wake Forest where we're getting good enough at learning that instruction set that we will be able to remake our body parts. And so in essence, what's going to happen to medicine is instead of having a titanium knee or a replacement metal hip, you will simply regrow your knee or regrow your hip because your body knows how to do that. So that's where I got about a decade ago. And it occurred to me that if you can remake your body parts in the same way as you remake your house, so you swap out, the windows and you swap out the cabinets and you change the sofas and you change the paint, we're going to be able to do that with our bodies. But that doesn't change longevity because the fundamental stopgap is the brain. And if you can't get the brain to last a lot longer without getting Alzheimer's or getting dementia or getting a series of other conditions, then longevity is capped at about 120, 130 years. So then what I did is I started working at MIT as an affiliate in a lab of a very bright guy called Ed Boyden on synthetic neurobiology. And so as I was doing that, I started looking at all these technologies that allow you to think about having the first full human brain map, which we don't have yet, about technologies that would allow you to map how memories are transmitted, how they're stored, how your brain reacts when you smell something, feel something, love something. And in all the talks I give, the question that keeps coming up is, what about the ethics of this? What about the ethics of having, brains deleted, memories, inserted memories, feelings altered, body parts remade? And you can see why people would think, hey, what about the ethics of this stuff? That's where I got into a very strange rabbit hole, because I thought, okay, I haven't answered this fully in the questions in the talks, so let me write a short article on what's right and what's wrong with gene research and brain research. And I thought that would be a short article because I thought, you know what? This is like these HR manuals or these catechisms where you simply write down right and wrong and give it to people and then they'll understand. Here's why it took me 6 years. Because when I started writing down what's right and wrong, I started figuring out 3 things. Ethics is not the obvious easy and boring topic we all think it is. So think about arriving at a university, think about arriving at a new job, whatever. And you get this giant document that says, here's the manual on right and wrong, here's the ethics, learn this, take a test, and then you'll be ethical. And usually that's a document written by Captain Obvious, and you know all that stuff, right? Nobody has to teach you that stuff. But that's not where real ethics sits. That's not why ethics is interesting. See, ethics is interesting when you begin to realize, maybe I really don't know exactly what's right and what's wrong. Or maybe I do know what's right, but maybe what's right changes, and changes over time. And the third thing that complicates this is maybe technology changes what's right and what's wrong. And that's especially important during a time when technology is beginning to move at exponential rates, because it means that ethics potentially can move at exponential rates. So let me unpack that for a second. I grew up being a little bigot. And I'll tell you why I was a little bigot. I went to Jesuit school in Mexico. And Jesuit school at that time, you went to Mass every morning at 7 a.m. till 8 a.m. And everybody in that Latin Mass and everybody on the playground and all the teachers and preachers and parents and laws and newspapers and everything else taught me as a young child that being gay would be awful, that it's one of the worst things that could happen to you. And it took me until high school to change from Mexico to one of the most progressive high schools in the United States. And I never heard about gay culture. I never heard about normalizing, respecting, having a open, friendship or anything with somebody who was gay. In fact, it was 15 years after I left this high school that there was a small ad in a newspaper called The Philippian that said, Gay Student Association meeting, all welcome. And that was it. And that was 15 years after I left. And by the way, that was the second oldest private high school gay student association in the United States. So it's not like the school was behind the times. It was only when I reached college that I met my first person who was openly gay. And this person was kind enough to tell me and explain to this, macho Mexican type why I was just so completely wrong on the subject. And he flipped my view 180 degrees. And by the way, something similar happened to a majority of the United States, because in 1997, 2/3 of the United States thought gay marriage was an abomination. And today it's 2/3 for. So you've had about a 180-degree shift in the majority opinion on, is it okay to be openly gay? Is it okay to marry somebody that you love that's same sex? Plus all of the other LGBTQ and other expressions of sexuality. And we're now thinking of sexuality and its expression in a completely different way from the way that I thought about it as a kid, or the way that I was brought up, or the way that I was taught. Had I not left Mexico, I may still have been a bigot, because I may not have been exposed to this culture, to this extraordinary group of people, to this extraordinary talent, and I would still have seen them as the others. What changed the view of, is it okay or not okay to practice and be out with a series of sexual desires, practices, identities? Well, to a great extent, it was technology. So part of it was the AIDS crisis that brought people in the streets to protest, to act up. Part of it was movies, part of it was radio, part of it was TV, part of it was meeting people across the country, in colleges, in workplaces, etc., where all of a sudden you realized my cousin, my brother, my sister, my friend, my child may have a completely different sexual identity. And all of a sudden it was very difficult. There was a dissonance between what we were being taught and what these people were, because they were extraordinary human beings who were close to us, as opposed to the others, the people practicing X, Y, or Z, which was to be condemned. That kind of 180-degree shift occurs more often than you can think. So what is legal, normal, expected during one time can seem barbarous and crazy to another time. When you go through an archaeology museum, you often see pictures, depictions of human sacrifice. And human sacrifice was normal, natural, legal, because otherwise the sun wouldn't rise, or the water wouldn't come, the rains wouldn't come. And now we look at that and kind of go, who were these people, and why in the hell did they make pyramids of skulls? Fast forward a few more centuries. It was normal, natural, and legal to have weekend executions in the great plazas of Paris. So you'd set up the guillotine, and you'd have giant crowds of people coming in their, finest clothing, bringing the children to watch an execution, and they would hold up the severed head for everybody to cheer at. And again, you're looking at that with today's eyes, and you're going, what the hell were these people thinking? How is it possible that they acted that way? So the point of all this is, even the people who think about morality the most and spend all day thinking about morality, like the Pope, can go from gay marriage is an abomination against God's will, and 3 years later say, who am I to judge? And a couple of years later say, I'm in favor of this, even though much of my flock is not. So you see flips even in people, not just in societies, that are thinking day and night about this stuff. Why is this so important for you and your business? Because increasingly when you go into a school or when you go into a business, what you find is a great deal of certainty, a great deal of righteousness, a great deal of anger, a great deal of I'm right, and if you dare disagree with me, even marginally on any topic, you are wrong. And as a result, we end up walking on eggshells because we might insult somebody because we're not addressing them the right way, or because we're not 100% agreeing with them, or because we're not respecting their identity, or because we're not doing X, Y, or Z. And I think it's incredibly important that in this time of righteous fury, of condemnation, that we think very carefully about right and wrong. Because part of the inspiration to write this book was a very good friend of mine and ex-Harvard professor who moved to Yale, lived through an incident that I think personifies how far we've gotten, how easy it is to characterize the others. So here's this guy recruited by Yale, one of the world's great scientists, just wrote one of the great books on COVID, who ends up at Yale with his wife, who's also a superb professor. And she writes an email at Halloween that says, there's been some questions about what you can wear and what you can't wear at Halloween. You're all adults. You should know what you can wear. Make your own decision. And that email was so controversial that there were protests across the university to expel her and cancel her as a professor for asking students to make up their own mind and decide what they wanted to wear at Halloween. The protests escalated, and my friend, Nicholas Christakis, came out and defended his wife. And the students not only protested in front of his house with his children, they not only held up placards and yelled at him to be canceled, they spit in his face. And, you don't do that. Okay, that is not the mark of a civilized debate on campus. You can disagree, you can express your ideas, but you don't yell and spit at somebody in front of their wife and kids. And that made me so angry that I thought, all right, okay, where are these people coming from? How can they do this? And I see more and more of that behavior in judging past actions. When you think about founding fathers, when you think about people who wrote books 100 years ago, when you think about comedians or something X time ago, when you think about what you posted 10 years ago, 10 months ago, 10 minutes ago, 10 seconds ago, you can be judged and condemned for any one of those things. And if right and wrong never changes, okay, maybe. But if the meaning of a word changes over time, if the meaning of an action, if the context of an action changes over time, then stuff that I, thank God, was not on Facebook because it didn't exist back when I was in high school or grammar school, could be thrown in my face today. And so I think what's really important for all of us to understand is the context of right and wrong can change. People can understand right and wrong at different parts of their journey. And 98 or 99% of people are trying to do the right thing. They may completely disagree with you. They may have a completely different viewpoint on right and wrong. They may have a very different viewpoint on politics. They may have a very different viewpoint on who their identity or their group is versus another. That doesn't say this is right. But it does say, take a tiny bit of time to understand why this person thinks so differently than you do. And that's incredibly important because you do have to isolate the 1 or 2% of a society that is truly bad, evil, and harmful. There are Nazis, there are KKK out there are sadists, there are people who brutalize other human beings. But when you separate societies into 49% versus 51%, and you can never talk to people who disagree with you, and they should just be canceled because they are baby killers, they are troglodytes, they are pedophiles, they are this, they are that, and we polarize society into trenches. We rip societies apart, and we rip nations apart, and we rip communities apart. And this is incredibly important because technology is going to challenge us. Technology is going to change what we think is right and wrong in fundamental ways. As synthetic meats move from $230,000 a hamburger to $9 a hamburger today, the majority that is not yet vegan is likely to shift towards more ethical, cruelty-free meats. And at that point, we may be seriously condemned because there's a picture of us at a barbecue on Bastille Day. As the price of solar and wind comes down and crosses coal and oil, the notion that all of us were burning coal and oil is going to seem savage to other people. As we're able to do different things with our body parts, the notion that we didn't edit genes, we didn't edit babies, which today is something that scares us, may seem something that is so primitive and backwards that you could see a conversation with your grandkids where they're saying, my grandparents were so backward, they didn't allow my mother to edit my body when I was an embryo, and therefore I now have cancer because they didn't take out the P53 or the BRCA2 or the KRAS gene. So the whole point of this is, the next time somebody comes in absolutely hell-bent on it's my way or the highway and you should be canceled, open up a conversation with the notion that maybe you're right, but right and wrong can change, and technology can change right and wrong. And let's have a conversation as to why you and I think differently and what might happen in the future. Because otherwise we're going to end up in a situation where we get into smaller and smaller medieval-like cities. We end up where we haven't just tripled the number of flags borders in Europe in the last century. We divide northern Italy, the Walloons, the Basques, the Catalans, the Welsh, the Scots. It's very easy to rip things apart. It's very easy to condemn the other. It's very easy to get furious. It's much harder to have a conversation about right, wrong, and that's what makes ethics such an interesting subject. So let me stop there and take your questions, comments, accusations, rebuttals, whatever you wish. So technology is a very strange thing, right? Because Hollywood usually presents technology as something dystopian and destructive. So think about the Terminator movies. But you can take something as horrific as slavery. And, you look at slavery and you say, how in the world did people do that for millennia? And why did they do it, not just in the US South, but in the US North and in Britain and in Africa and in India and Greece and China and every society? Why did they allow that? What was wrong with these people? And then, of course, there's a very interesting follow-up, which is why did it stop? And why did it stop being legal? It hasn't stopped completely, I get that. But why did it stop being legal in almost every country in the world in a very short period of time, in decades? And part of it was certainly the abolitionists who put their necks on the line, who, with incredible bravery, spoke out, like Harriet Tubman and Harriet Beecher Stowe. But there's a second potential part of the story, which is a single barrel of oil contains 10 years of a person's labor in energy equivalent. And when you tie that to thousands of horsepower, all of a sudden you can produce millions of human hours of work without having to enslave millions of people. And it gives you a series of ways of working that societies didn't have before. Does that justify slavery? No, it does not. Was it wrong? Yes, it was absolutely, completely a wrong practice. But we did that for tens of thousands of years, and then we stopped. And I'd love to say it's because all of a sudden we read the right books. And that was part of it. But the other part of it is we had options that previous civilizations didn't have. And that's a very cruel and nasty truth, and one that we have to face up to. Because no, slavery was not right in any way, shape, or form. But we as human beings across societies and civilizations allowed it. So look, I haven't said anything controversial in the least so far, so let's become slightly controversial and talk about sex. Imagine a conversation with your grandparents about sex, about the birds and the bees. So you bring your grandparents home to your dining room table in a time machine, except you bring them home as 20-something-year-olds. You talk about sex. They knew a lot about sex because they were likely married. But the stuff we take for granted would seem so completely wrong to them. Okay? Start with contraception. Grandpa, Grandma, do you realize you can now have all the sex you want and never have a baby? Yes, there was some primitive contraception back then, but it didn't work very well. And it was not really allowed. And so that would seem very odd to them. And then you're going to tell them about in vitro fertilization because you're going through cancer treatments. And they say, hang on for a second. Two bodies never have to be in the same room. They never have to touch each other, and you can conceive a child. We used to call that the Immaculate Conception, and that was a miracle. And then you tell them about surrogate babies and surrogate mothers. About surrogate mothers and how you pay them and how they carry the baby and how you can freeze embryos and how you can freeze eggs, which means another woman can birth the baby that you and your wife conceived. And if she conceived of twins, you can have identical twins born 30 years apart. So you've decoupled sex from consequence, you've decoupled sex from physical contact, and you've decoupled sex from time. And we think that's normal and natural. And your grandparents would think, what in the world are you thinking? Why do you think that is right? Fast forward the conversation. Your grandkids, age 70, bring you home and start telling you about sex. Do you think sex is going to look anything like what it looks like today? Do you think that things that they take for granted wouldn't seem completely weird and unnatural to us? Like being able to conceive a child in the equivalent of a Ziploc bag outside the body. We haven't done that with humans yet, but we're now doing it with lambs. Like editing embryos. Like having different people conceive children from cells in the body. Right? These are all things which have a huge yuck factor to all of us, but may be completely normal, natural, something to be discussed over a Starbucks latte in 70 years. So as you think about the future, as you think about right and wrong, just understand that different civilizations at different times can think that things we're doing today are completely unnatural and wrong. And things they're going to do, we may look at and say, why would they ever do that? So look, I started out where perhaps some of you are, which is, I know right from wrong. I know that if I follow these commandments, or if I follow this catechism, or if I follow these rules, then I'm going to do the right thing. And, I think that's where individuals and societies and companies end up on the wrong side of history. Because in thinking they're doing the right thing, the legal thing, they end up doing things which will be seen as horrendous going forward. So I think the first thing to do in teaching people this stuff is to go through a journey that says, maybe you're right, but what if right and wrong changes over time? And what could change right and wrong? And let's think about past examples and let's think about the future. I mean, let's close this with, I'm an optimistic curmudgeon. I think things are going to get better. And I understand that things are horrendous today and we're living in the middle of unprecedented healthcare challenges and political challenges and all kinds of challenges. But I would love to go into one of these pods and wake up in 100 years, because I don't think I'd wake up to a dystopian world. I think I'd wake up to a world that is likely more generous, and has a better sense of right and wrong than we have today. And it's not a linear journey. It's not a straight journey. But I think human beings have gotten more generous, and I think we can be more generous. Think about what's happened to capitalism. For the greatest period of time, economics and capitalism was the allocation of scarcity. And now we're living in an era of abundance. There is more than enough penicillin for everybody. There's more than enough vaccines. There's more than enough food calories. There's more than enough plastic shelter. So we've generated wealth as we never have before. And it becomes an issue of distribution as opposed to availability. You can no longer hide behind the fig leaf of there wasn't enough food for everybody and that's why we had famines. You can no longer hide behind the fig leaf of there wasn't enough medicine to go around. Yes, there is. And it becomes, again, an issue of distribution, not availability. And that changes the fundamental rules of economics and will allow us to be, if we choose to be, a more generous species. But we should also be judged if we don't become a more generous species. And that's the challenge of modern ethics. So let's talk about the precautionary principle. So in Europe, the precautionary principle judges new technologies, and the basic rule is, if this is a technology that can hurt people, it shouldn't be approved. So prove to me that your new technology won't hurt human beings, and I will approve it. And, that sounds absolutely rational and wonderful until you begin to unpack it. Because under a precautionary principle, a staircase would never be approved as an architectural plan for a house. Salt could not be on the table. You could not have an electric socket. You could not have metals because they can be used to hurt people in weapons. So I think what you have to think about is not the technology that does things to our brain fundamentally. It's what is acceptable and how is that going to evolve. So think about being able to erase memories. That is a technology that is coming online. It is very rough, but it's possible. And so if you use optogenetics, you can erase some memories, and sometimes you can induce some feelings through light, not through chemicals. You already do a lot of that through chemicals. Should you be able to do that? And the answer is not a yes, no. It's if you're taking somebody who has intractable PTSD and is suicidal, maybe you do want to erase or edit certain things, especially if nothing else is working. It gets much more complicated if you're erasing an X, or if you're erasing a bad Y, or if you're inducing a good X. And those are the debates that we're going to have. These are real debates. These are not abstract debates, and they're coming over the next decade. And rather than taking a yes-no position on that, I'd like us to have an evolving conversation as these technologies get deployed, decentralized, and deployed, because these are going to be real topics. This is not brain surgery. This is DIY, do-it-yourself at home. And it's coming much slower than you would wish if you were sick, but much faster than many of us are expecting it. And therein lies the challenge and the beauty and the interest and the absolutely extraordinary world of ethics, which I had no idea existed until I started working on this. And that's why I got enthralled on it. That's why I wrote this book over the 6 years. Because I thought it was going to be a short journey and I thought I knew. And boy, was I wrong.